So much. So you will not all be aware, but this is a reunion of sorts because Mrs. Haq was my first boss ever when I was in Pakistan in 1999 to work on the Human Development Report for South Asia on gender issues. So it's really a true honor and pleasure to be here moderating the event, and she already hinted at some of the amazing accomplishments in her time, but I think one of them, Richard and I would agree, is being a mentor and a leader for so many young and then not so young scholars in the field of human development. I just wanted to note a few things. One is a volume that is right here that she'll be speaking about, her recent release, Economic Growth with Social Justice, the collected writings of Mahbub-ul Haq. And I think you will all agree that these are persistent issues, but especially in this new political and economic environment, I think it's really helpful to take a step back and think about the trajectory, and even as we push for more progress, to recognize that some of the changes that both Mrs. Haq and Dr. Haq were at the forefront of, and we have so many people here representing it, have been so critical to human progress. So I want to now turn it over to Mrs. Haq for special remarks.
Thank you, Cindy. It is so nice to see somebody like you. I remember, full of bins in the work. And she was so excited about being in Islamabad. Not many people these days will agree with you. But anyway, I was very happy to receive this invitation from Richard. He was again one of our recruits, joined from Yale. It was Fulbright sent you to Pakistan.
Came from the Fletcher School where your daughter attended.
Fletcher School. He came to Pakistan for a year. He stayed for 2 years. And that was a very difficult period. That was the time when Mahbub passed away. And I just couldn't go to office to work. This guy came to home and sat there on a chair and said, Mrs. Haq, you have to get up and you have to start doing the work. We'll help you, but get up and go to office, do the work. Richard, as well as many other youngsters. So I went back to work and continued till, as I said, 5 months ago. So anyway, I am very happy that I accepted Richard's invitation to come here and see all of you. Many of you have known Alex for years and years at the World Bank.
I should have said earlier that one real reason for being here is that I worked for Mahbub-ul Haq for many years at the World Bank.
Yes, yes.
It's a pleasure to be back here.
Thank you. It was lovely to see all of you. So, thank you, Cindy. I'm supposed to give you an introduction to Human Development School of Thought that Mahbub-ul Haq introduced in early 1990s through the UNDP Human Development Reports. Mahbub-ul Haq profoundly changed the way development policies were framed and practiced. I think World Bank wouldn't like to hear about it, but that is true statement. At that time, everybody used to say it. He questioned the prevalent development philosophy and pioneered the concept and practical application of the human development model. Revolutionized the economic and social development policies. He provided the world with a statistical measure, Human Development Index, to quantify the indicators of economic growth with human development. It is said that in the 1990s, this was recognized as one of the few great ideas of the 20th century. The human development model goes beyond treating human beings as only a means to the production process. While human productivity is an essential element of economic growth, to treat human being as only a resource for the production process obscures the centrality of people as the ultimate end of development. Human development is concerned with building human capabilities through investment in education and health. It is also concerned with using those capabilities fully through an enabling framework for growth and employment. Human development model regards economic growth as essential, but pays equal attention to its quality and distribution and its link to human lives and sustainability. The critical difference between economic growth model and human development model is that the first focuses exclusively on the expansion of income, while the second embraces the enlargement of all human choices, economic, political, social, and cultural. Human development model questions the presumed automatic link between expanding income and expanding choices. Such a link depends on the quality and distribution of economic growth, not only on the quantity of such growth. A link between human lives has to be created. A link between growth and human lives has to be created consciously through deliberate public policy, such as public spending on social services and fiscal policy to redistribute income and wealth. Now, these are not new stuff to any one of you, but when they started it, these are really new thought, because the growth alone philosophy, which was World Bank kept on spreading all over the world, was not enough to either reduce poverty or to increase human lives. So anyway, so GNP growth, that was the main focus of economic development policies prevalent at that period. HDI does not replace GDP, but it adds considerably to an understanding of the reality of a society in several ways. Besides income, HDI measures education and health, and thus it is multidimensional. HDI focuses the attention of policymakers on the ultimate objective of development. HDI is more meaningful as a national average than income, as there are much greater extremes in income distribution. HDI can be usefully disaggregated by gender, geographic region, etc. GDP by itself reveals little about how people live in a society. It is the actual distribution and use of income that is decisive. For policymakers of developing countries, human development model is useful in several areas. It gives a wake-up call to policymakers. A quick look at HDI rankings shows which countries are combining economic growth with social development. It identifies areas that need urgent policy attention. It identifies potential for the growth of a country. Disaggregated HDI becomes a powerful tool for improving governance. And HDI can be used as an early warning system. The genius of human development model stems in large part from its ability to flexibly absorb a broad and complex agenda while remaining relevant as an analytical tool and foundation for conceiving creative policy and institutional reform ideas. So this is just an intro to show that what is the basic ideas we have been working on and trying to look at a country or a region or the worldwide to see what ways we can influence people's life more meaningfully than looking at only the GNP growth. You can have a GNP growth, I mean, I can just talk about a lot of countries here which got a high GNP growth, but that people are shivering and they don't have education and health. But anyway, I thought that I'll just tell you this before you have the launching of the book. So do you want to do my economic growth one also along with it?
If you wish to say a few words about.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, great.
Okay. Now, when you were working in Islamabad and you have a lot to do, you do a lot, but you also look at all the boxes and boxes of papers left over by Mahbub-ul-Haq. So over the years, we have published quite a lot of them. We have used quite a lot of them for our South Asia Human Development Report, because that's what I produce, the Mahbub-ul-Haq Center produces annually. So most recently, last year, when I was looking at some of those boxes every time I open a box, a book appears at the end of it. So what happened that I saw that lots of articles, Mahbub used to give speeches. These are not the written articles, but these are basically extempore speeches, newspaper interviews, whatever. These are all unpublished. So I sat down with them and organized them according to the decade, each decade. In the 60s, what was his mind was focusing, and 70s, what was his focusing. Each decade was different, but each decade he was revising his earlier views and going forward is something new. Because that's how growth philosophy became the, model for social justice. Because once you have gone through all those countries, all those years, you change. So Richard said I should also say a few words about this report, what it's all about, this book. This is the new book issued by Oxford University Press. It's Economic Growth with Social Justice. This is the collected writings of Mahbub Haq. Okay? So these essays offer a unique perspective on the evolution of Mahbub Haq's contribution to economic and social development philosophy. It encompasses various stages of Haq's professional life from the 1960s to his death in 1998. The compilation considers the origins of significance of Haq's development philosophy in influencing academic discourse and policymaking of national governments and international institutions at a time of great political and social change around the world. So that's what it is. These are all. So it is. This volume traces evolution over 4 decades of Haq's philosophy of economic growth, poverty alleviation, and social justice into a development philosophy. Put all of those different things. I put them into a development philosophy. Each decade witnessed Haq learning lessons from his close encounter with the political reality of the day, making him evaluate some of his own assumptions and refine his tools to achieve his ultimate goal, to make people the center of all development policies, programs, and actions. So that's what it is. Okay, thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for those remarks. It's so many, in fact, just emotions and reflections come to mind. But the first is a few things you said. The fact that some of what Mahbub Haq really was at the forefront of, because it seems so everyday, that's part of the legacy, that the framework for thinking about these issues is so embedded in the way we think. And at the same time, some of the key questions I think still arise. Fatima and I worked at the Millennium Challenge Corporation at the same time, and I remember active discussions on, well, what's the distributional effect of this $500 million program, and it's still something that people struggle with. So I think it's both that it's revolutionized our thinking, but those ideas are still so fresh and critical to grapple with. So thank you so much. And it's his legacy and your legacy, so we really appreciate you being here to share the thoughts and to introduce this book. So we're really delighted. It's funny, when I was in Islamabad working on the South Asia Human Development Report, I would always imagine, I was just out of college, and I was always imagining, who are those people in New York? I mean, they were this a very august and elevated group in my mind who were working away and driving the major global institutions. So it's really wonderful to be here now with Jonathan Hall, the head of unit for the Human Development Report Office, to provide an overview. I believe we also have the summary copies of the 2016 report, and also reflect a little bit on, from the 1990s to today, what this report means.
Okay, thanks, Cindy. As Cindy said, it's quite a legacy since 1990. We've done 26 global reports. This is the overview of the 26th, which came out earlier this year, and I'll leave that here for people. There've also been, there's a whole industry of human development reporting around the world. There's been over 700 national and regional reports, and subnational from at least 130 countries. So a lot has happened since then. It really has, I think, changed the debate. When I started working on new measures of progress back in my own country in Australia in 2000, even the most enlightened economists I would speak to would say, look, we know the problems with GDP, but it correlates with everything that's important. And now that mindset really has changed a lot, largely because of the HDI. And as Google had said, he recognized it was as vulgar as GDP, but it's just a better thing. So it took on the reports have had tremendous reach and still have tremendous reach. I mean, there's many ways to look at that, but one is just to look at the people who contribute articles to our reports and sign boxes. In the last couple of years, we've had Bill Gates, we've had Melinda Gates, we've had Angela Merkel, Professor Stephen Hawking. It really attracts a wide range of very distinguished people who know the report, who can see its importance. But of course, it does need to stay contemporary, to adapt to current challenges. Human development as a concept is very broad and all-encompassing, but the way in which we apply it, we recognize we need to sort of keep up with the world as it is today. In the last few years, we did a report on vulnerability and resilience, recognizing that it's all very well to have development, but how fragile are those gains? How can we secure those gains for people, especially in a world which is a little more prone to risks, whether it's from climate change or global shocks that are more likely and more contagious now the world's living in. In 2015, we took on work. We tried to sort of take a broader perspective on work from a human development point of view, saying work is much more than we just take jobs. It's all the activities we do. How can we frame a conversation around that? And in 2016, we looked at human development for everyone, really about how can we make this more inclusive, very much tied to the Sustainable Development Goals. And there are a number of interesting things, I think, in that report. One of them, which really struck me, is this idea that the development community has tended to focus on the things they can see and can measure, the tangible aspects of development. And that, obviously health and education are very important, but human development also recognizes the importance of other things that are much harder to measure with statistics. Things like voice, dignity. How do you get a handle on that? How can you start thinking about that? I really find it so difficult to measure those things. Something like voice, which is both primary outcome of development, but also primary means of development. Giving people say, decision making. That's really important, I think, for building a stronger foundation, particularly if we're to reach the people, large minority people who still get left out by development gains. The same groups in every country are still having a hard time, are being missed both by the statistics and by the progress that's happening to others around them. Looking to the future, the next report will be about measurement. And we're thinking about many things, but I think we're recognizing we need to increase both the breadth and the depth of our measures. The breadth in the Human Development Index is health, education, and income, but how can we go beyond that to start measuring these other things, some of these intangible things, and the depth too in the quality of the statistics of what we measure, because it's one thing to know how many kids go to school in the country. It's quite another to know are they actually learning anything. So how can we start measuring those things in a richer, deeper picture of human development? And of course, tying the human development approaches to the 2030 agenda is something we're thinking about, talking about. The two approaches are completely complementary. They're both trying to achieve the same thing. They're both got people, reduction in poverty at their heart. So they shouldn't be seen in competition with one another. How can we at the UNDP ensure that people working on the 2030 agenda can learn from the human development approach to best achieve those goals, and how can we learn from the work they're doing for human development? So, thanks.
Thank you so much. And recently, my research is focused on refugees, forced displacement, and development. And so it's really, what you say, of course, is so apt for this population in terms of not having the statistics or data not being counted, in addition to the intangible measurements that we need to achieve a more just society. So very excited that the centerpiece of this event is the launch of the book by Richard and Anuraba,
the State Department. So it's really, again, an honor and pleasure to be here. He is the director of the Just Security 2020 program here at the Stimson Center, and then his co-author, Anuragha Ghosh, is founder and CEO of the Council on Energy, Environment, and Water. And they are going to provide an overview of this book, but then I also hope reflect on how this applies to our current situation. So over to you.
Thank you so much, Cindy, and welcome everybody once again. Before Arnab and I give a brief overview of some of the findings from the book, it's truly a pleasure first to welcome Mrs. Huck to the Stimson Center, to thank you for your very thoughtful opening remarks and honoring us with your presence today, but to also thank you, as Cindy well noted, that you've been such a source, you and Dr. Huck, of inspiration and mentorship for so many young and not so young people over so many years. To also thank, of course, Cindy, Bob, and Jonathan for contributing to today's program, and to the editors for this series that our book is a part of, Professor Thomas Weiss and Rorden Wilkinson, their Global Institution series. Encourage you to take a look at some of the other titles through the Routledge website. So as we heard today, and Jonathan, the number has gone up by another 100. There are actually 800 national, regional, and subnational HDRs. I heard this from your boss a month ago when they launched the collected writings of Mahbub Huq, a big event in New York honoring Mrs. Huq's latest publication, and of course 25 HDRs over these last 2.5 decades. And they really helps remind us how UNDP had the foresight and courage to get behind Dr. Huq's vision, the idea of an annual report on the state of the human condition that would, in his words, promote a candid, uninhibited dialogue on the state of people's well-being instead of only on the state of national economies. So human development, as Mrs. Huq has just reminded us, is in essence about enlarging the process of people's choices. And this is very much happening through building human capabilities or agency to realize those choices. In our examination of this powerful idea and its influence on and within global institutions over the past 2.5 decades, Arnab and I found that human development has had a profound impact on shaping the policy agenda and programming priorities of global institutions, such as the UN up the road and the IFIs here in this town. In doing so, what is often referred to as the Human Development School of Thought has helped to preserve the continued vitality of major multilateral development programs, funds, agencies, and banks. So for our overview presentation and the way the book is structured, we anchored it around 4 fundamental questions. First, has human development transformed how human development is understood in global governance? Second, to what extent have international policymakers sought to advance human development reform priorities in international policy forums? Third, what are the emerging human development ideas and innovations in global governance? And fourth and finally, what constraints and challenges, whether policy, resource, technical, and others, were confronted or are expected in pursuing this agenda? I'll be speaking to the first 2 questions, and Arnab, playing cleanup, will speak to the latter 2. On the first major question, dealing with whether human development has transformed how development is understood in global governance, we found that the Human Development School of Thought has contributed to a paradigmatic shift in development thinking within global institutions, from an emphasis, as we heard today, in GDP growth and per capita income as the chief barometers of a nation's progress, to a broader notion that balances economic with social, cultural, and political dimensions of development. This more holistic or integrated understanding of human well-being and agency coincided with and informed critiques in the 1990s about the then prevailing Washington Consensus and the associated structural adjustment policies of the IFIs, leading to important policy shifts that were played out in that series of UN World Conferences, which I hope my friend Bob Berg will speak to, in the early 1990s. And these led to a more goal-oriented poverty alleviation set of strategies where economic growth is consciously made more pro-poor and pro-people. To aid this effort, and an area that I know Jonathan works very closely on with the HRO team, a number of new innovative measurement composite indices were developed, and hopefully during our discussion we'll have a chance to come back to some of those. Before turning to our study's second major question, I wish to offer one more example of how human development shifted and expanded what is commonly perceived as the goal of development today. While emanating from the traditional development community, the HDRs had a significant impact on thinking and practice in the related areas of conflict, security, and justice, the nexus of these three in global governance, where first in the 93, but especially the 94 report dedicated to the issue of human security, which is defined as people exercising their human development choices safely and freely and ensuring freedom from fear and freedom from want. By the late 90s, countries such as Canada, Japan, Chile, many other influential countries, even non-state actors, got behind what was called the Human Security Agenda. And this contributed to a broader understanding of the myriad sources of violent conflict and the need to inject targeted resources for human development into any kind of strategic framework or sectoral measures aiming to cope with violent conflict and reduce the likelihood of its recurrence. In short, both human development and human security place people at the center of peace building, serving as both the ends and chief means towards achieving sustainable peace. Besides the HDR summary, we also have a few copies of a summary of another report that will be released by one of our experts, Ted Picone, at Brookings Institution next Wednesday, which is on human security and democracy. And we very much encourage everybody here to participate in that event. I get a commission from every copy that is sold, I was told. In response to our second fundamental question on the extent to which policymakers sought to advance human development priorities in global governance, Arnab and I, we cited extensive empirical evidence, which I know is out of fashion these days, from international conferences, periodic meetings of the global bodies, international trade negotiations, and other international policy forums over the past 2.5 decades, in considering whether and to what extent a human development policy framework, measurement tools, and specific policy priorities shape the global policy agenda, such as, for example, redirecting investments in national armaments toward investments in a nation's citizens, a hot topic, the peace dividend in the post-Cold War era, at least the early days. Since we're here in Washington, let me note that senior World Bank officials in the late 1990s, starting with then World Bank James Wolfenson, began citing human development quite regularly in major speeches, and during the 2000s, a new network for human development was established at the World Bank, home for policy programs and research in the fields of education, health, social protection, and labor. Since I have a World Bank friend sitting here, I hope that network still exists. It's going strong. That's good to hear. Albeit adopting a narrower definition of human development than UNDP and the authors of the HDRs, the creation, for example, of senior World Bank positions dedicated to human development have translated into increasing concern for poverty alleviation and strengthening human capabilities. Of course, you're familiar with new tools such as the poverty reduction strategy papers and increased resources, indeed, to this agenda. Let me finish by noting that successive global HDRs have advocated for important global institutional reforms that have generated traction in international policy circles, such as increasing direct civil society organization participation in the deliberation of the major UN organs, or the idea of a 22-member, very powerful Economic Security Council. And while that idea, of course, hasn't come to play, replacing the Economic and Social Council, in many ways, a lot of the ideas were taken on board by the G20, especially since the financial crisis of 2008-9, when the meetings in this town were elevated to a heads of state level gathering. And finally, the HDRs have focused global attention on improving the World Trade Organization consultations, negotiations, and decision-making to make its work more transparent and participatory. At this time, though, I'm happy to welcome my co-author, Arnab, back to Washington. Over to you.
Thank you, Richard, and good afternoon to all of you. My first set of thanks go to Richard for not just being a friend, but being a very, very, very patient co-author. For several years, this was work in progress, and of course, a human development comrade for long. I did spend several years at the Human Development Report Office. One of the reports I worked on is on this table. So it was both a trip down memory lane, as it is for many of us today, but also an opportunity to rethink how those issues apply to the crises and the concerns we have today. Thanks very much to Mrs. Huck, Cindy, Mr. Berg, and Jonathan for also joining us. So I'll pick up where Richard left off with the final two questions we tried to encounter in the book. Like, what are the emerging or new innovations that the human development paradigm was able to inject into various global institutions and measures, and modes of global governance? And what are the new challenges or constraints that are confronting the pursuit of this agenda? So let me try and do this by highlighting some specific examples from the areas of international trade, access to water and energy, and the role of balancing growth with the environment. And then I'll close by talking about a few emerging issues that I feel ought to get some attention. Now, Richard just left off with the issue of the G20 in one example. In 2017, it seems fairly obvious that China, India, Brazil, South Africa would be at a table along with the United States, United Kingdom, Germany, thinking about issues of global significance. But even 15 years ago, this would not have been the obvious setting in a room in, say, this city. And it goes to show how the human development lens matters not just for inequity between individuals, but also inequity between countries, and how that can, the combination of the two begins to shape the agenda of global institutions, which was really what we were trying to look at in this book. So to give you one example, for instance, from the world of international trade, is how intellectual property rules were reinterpreted using a human development lens. Right through the 90s, when the birth of the WTO also resulted in the birth of the more rigid approach to intellectual property protection under the TRIPS agreement, there was contestation, whether by civil society, by developing country governments, etc. But come around, and there were several human development reports that were beginning to highlight that this contestation needed to be addressed. But come 2001, the cases going on in South Africa against pharmaceutical companies, but also the anthrax attack here in the United States, all resulted in a kind of thinking that a more human-centered lens would require us to rethink how intellectual property rules were being considered, which resulted in the TRIPS and Public Health Declaration. And 2 years later, the WTO's General Council took a decision to ensure access to cheap drugs for countries without pharmaceutical manufacturing capacity. So it demonstrated how a human development lens could force a renegotiation and reinterpretation of international law. Another example, water and sanitation. Despite the emphasis on basic deprivation and water, which has persisted in kind of the basic needs discourse, a lot of the focus of initial sort of international agendas for development focused on broader national targets rather than the inequities that you observe in access to something as basic as water. So the 2006 Human Development Report, which I worked on, tried to bring what we call the power, politics, and inequality of water front and center. That was also the first year of what the United Nations called the International Decade of Action for Water for Life. So that framing then began to change how water was being debated in the UN General Assembly. 2008 became the International Year of Sanitation, and then the language of water as a human right, which was also brought out in the HDRs, became something that was embedded in various other international fora, whether it's World Health Organization in 2011, even the Human Rights Council in 2011. Another set of examples from the interaction of the human and the physical environment. And the very first Human Development Report recognized, just as Jonathan was highlighting, that some things are harder to measure, and we're still kind of getting our heads around how do you look at natural capital, how do you look at the impact of the human externalities of human actions on the natural environment and so forth. But if you think about how this nexus of access to energy, environmental constraints, local as well as global, including climate change, and development sit together, you begin to notice through the years an emphasis in the human development reports on matters of human security, on the impact of environmental degradation on the poor, not just in general, that it's not an environmental issue, it becomes a development issue. The different ways in which you look at intergenerational and intragenerational equity, and issues of sustainable consumption, which was addressed by the Human Development Reports way back in the 1990s. So again, as a concrete example, the MDGs did not have energy access as a goal. But the 2007-8 Human Development Report on climate change again placed energy access, front and center of the debate. Of course, it was something that developing countries were arguing for a long time, but it became the basis on which then UN Energy reconstituted its approach to energy. That then fed into the discussions around the Rio +20 summit, the future we want document, and of course the SDGs as they were articulated in 2015, with energy access being a key issue. If you look at across these issues of trade, water, energy, climate change, environment, you see a few common threads that the human development paradigm keep emphasizing. The thread of access to opportunity, and the absence of this becomes a disabler of whatever kind of development you want. Second, the thread of vulnerability, again, Jonathan was just highlighting that, and its impact on the poor. And finally, how we reformulate what was originally considered a Western agenda of sustainability and a Southern agenda of development into what is now considered a sustainable human development. And of course, we can get into that in detail. Let me just spend my last couple of minutes trying to highlight what are some of the new challenges that emerge. And since we're plugging many books and reports, let me plug my other book called Energizing India, which looks out 30 years from now when, say, Pakistan and India will be 100-year-old independent countries. We're going through major energy transitions, and we have to go through a pattern of development very different from what others have managed to do in the past. If you apply a human development lens, you begin to see that there are many emerging issues that not yet have been completely solved. Number one, how do you measure something like energy access? This multidimensionality of development that was introduced to the HDI, then the poverty indicators that have emerged. We've tried, my institution, CEW, has tried to do that on energy access, on a multidimensional metric. We've, as a result, conducted the world's largest survey on energy access using this kind of a methodology, collecting 2.5 million data points. When you do that, you see it's not just about a wire coming into your household. It's the quality of the power, the reliability, the safety, the vulnerability, etc., associated with it. We know that the World Bank is also using multidimensional metrics in what is now called the Global Tracking Framework for Energy Access. And, so this is now, the multidimensionality seems to be the new normal, but you've got to remember where it all began. Another example, an issue that has not yet been entirely settled, in fact will grow, is this challenge between pushing clean energy while maintaining open trade and markets. The WTO rules actually conflict against a push towards clean energy. Because if you were to subsidize clean energy at home, you would run up against the legality of WTO rules. Between 2009, the failed Copenhagen Climate Summit, and 2015, the successful Climate Summit in Paris, 11% of new WTO disputes were regarding clean energy. But clean energy does not account for 11% of global trade. So what's happening is we've again put on our heads a hat of mercantilism. Now let me capture global market share for something that is still a very small marginal sector that needs collective action across the world to be pushed. And this will only grow as a consequence of trying to square the circle of maintaining trade markets and openness and pushing sustainable energy on the other hand. And finally, let me give an example from the world of, again from the world of energy, but back to a focus on the poor. There is no global energy organization. Right? Yet the world of energy is looking very different in terms of the demanders, the sources, the vulnerabilities, the risks, and the resilience concerns. But the newest international organization that is now being formulated, and I'm proud to have been involved in the very initial conceptualization of it, is something called the International Solar Alliance. I don't know how many of you have heard of it. It was announced on the first day of the Paris climate negotiations. But the idea was that let's refocus international partnerships with a focus on what the poor need. If you look at clean energy, the biggest problem right now is the cost of financing this kind of infrastructure. So the International Solar Alliance comes together to aggregate demand and lower the risks so that you lower the cost of capital. And then you pool resources for future R&D. So what I'm trying to highlight is that if you look at the past in terms of international frameworks, and you look at the present, it seems to me that we have embedded in ourselves a multidimensional approach to understanding development, our understanding of vulnerability and access as sort of two sides of coins. But there are still emerging issues that haven't been settled yet, and innovations are needed at the national, regional, and global level to pursue the agenda. Let me stop there.
Great, thank you so much. Those are very compelling examples, and I'm sure everyone will have a lot of comments. I'm very delighted to have as our respondent Bob Berg, who is Distinguished Fellow and Director of the Working with New Majority New Majority Program. Sorry, you're going to have to explain it to people, and especially I think around the rise of middle-income countries. So really look forward to your remarks.
Anyway, if you assume that I've been called gathered A.K. Sen and Paul Stritton and Richard Jolly and Francis Stewart and several others. And in essence, that first intellectual group in the late 90s, late 1940s, I'm sorry, was useful, but GDP, as we've been saying here, didn't tell us how people were actually doing, nor what their social and economic status should be. That was the well-considered long-term interest of Longwood. The second wave that he led of intellectual might was different from the first wave because it was prescriptive across the whole field of development. And there was a second difference as well. The UN has often had numerous reports. They used to actually, in the budget system, you would get your money based on the number of reports you issued. God help us. And they had declared numerous years for this and decades for that. But these declarations were often hollow, and they weakened the UN's credibility. In 1990, Jim Grant, then head of UNICEF, invented a different strategy. He married great policy with law, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and high-stakes politics, the World Summit for Children. And that was the first time that global heads of state met and acted to advance the UN mission. That formula, the UN articulating policy and fostering law and high-level political leaders particularly, empowered the UN to have much more influence and impact. I see that since we're sitting in a think tank, it changes the course of think tanks. When I was first in a think tank in the 1980s, we would spend about 92, 99% of our budget on production and very little on marketing. Now there are think tanks in this town who have a 10-90. They do a little bit of thinking and a huge amount of marketing, but they are pressed not on the production of thought, but on the production of political impact. That formula then led directly to the Millennium Development Goals and the Sustainable Development Goals, and moreover, it forced the UN family, often a rather dysfunctional family of separate organizations, to work together for common purpose, enabled by a real board of directors, the chief executive board, holding agencies accountable for policy. In the 1990s, mid-1990s, in response to UN system-wide work that I was involved in, for the first time the World Bank started to attend the UN's heads of agency meetings. All this led to growing credibility for the UN, and in time gave it the standing to effectively broker the world's first agreement with real hope for the environment. Now we have a UN that is much more legitimate. It's guiding its members, as we said, all these reports going on, but for more than this reports, for the technical backstopping of the substance of those reports. Much more aggressive as well on political issues, tenfold increase, use conversions. So I was wondering,
First, thanks to all of the panelists for their remarks. And just that was all very profound, but I think one thing, and especially your overview of the intellectual history and these major changes that really strikes me, is that there's something so unique both about a moment and the people who can be at that cusp of both intellectual innovation, responding to the challenges of the day, and then also have a strategy and coalition to bring change to a very large and complex system, not only within the UN or large organizations like the World Bank and beyond. I know we have some of those leaders here today who have some of these thoughts, but it is, I think, really a time for that pivot. So we have about 15, 20 minutes to hear your comments on questions on the rich array of issues that were raised today. Yes, please.
A couple comments and then a question. There's that cheeky expression, old wine in new bottles. The human development idea is a good wine that has been placed in new bottles repeatedly. And in fact, that self-plug had a book on human dignity, which talks all about agency and recognition, and it's really product. Human security is an example of that. But that's an interesting thing. How do you keep the power of the idea when people call it new things?
Right.
Or add things to it. Measuring, it really is an important point that you make about measuring. I think we need to have a comfort level with grappling with things that are hard to measure. I used to work at Freedom House and its leadership. It does a pretty good job at looking at really important questions of governance and civil society that are hard to measure. There are many things that are about agency that really are hard to measure, and we need to figure out how to continue to press on those issues. Last comment is that politics matter, and I think his last set of comments about who can galvanize leadership in the UN is important. There have been very important moments where ideas were connected to political will. Kofi Annan was particularly good at that. Antonio Guterres has the misfortune of being Secretary General at the moment of the refugee crisis under President Trump, but sometimes politics really matters. My question is holism. There's so much that is touched on by human development. It seems to me that its great strength is that it suggests, it sort of returns to the we the people's notion that it's people, not states, that matter, people, not disembodied economies that matter. Is there a danger, not with climate change, which is enormously important to improvement, but is there a danger of adding too many things in? How do you grapple with, and maybe Richard is the person to speak with the holism problem that if everything matters, does nothing matter? How do you prioritize certain things so that human development can still matter by emphasizing some things that are more important?
Should we take a few?
Yeah, that's a good idea.
It's a limited amount of
No, there is. You're right. So let's do 3 or 4 comments, and then we can have people respond. Yeah, Jeff.
So you'll take a stab related to Bob's challenge to come up with good questions. Not to say that this year is a great way of how about enough? It's really hard to crack. And just to start, a kernel of an idea for something along those lines might actually be conflict prevention and post-conflict stabilization. If we think about where the world is on this topic, and this obviously relates to human development, by human security, that nexus. If we look at the global supply of post-conflict stabilization, it has gone dramatically down, while the demand for it has gone dramatically up in recent years. If you look at, for example, right here in Washington, the Bureau of the State Department that is supposed to have this task, where Richard and I used to work, and the International Stabilization and Peacebuilding Initiative that once had 23 donors in it, including even NATO, by the way, has completely withered on the vine due to the global financial crisis never formally ended. And this doesn't even get to conflict prevention.
lightning round of these three, and then we'll have the panelists respond.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. I want to follow up on your question and pose another question from the national perspective of developing countries. I work with UNDP, and I had the privilege of heading up 3 different country programs in my past career, where I had the privilege of being involved with national human development reports. In my experience in my home country at the time in the 90s was that we were able to use the human development concept and the reports to talk a lot about inequality, to talk about introducing into the lexicon of Turkish development planners at the time the word poverty, which was illegal practically to use in public documents. So all of these were, I think, advancements that we were able to have. But as Cindy, you were saying, we had the cusp of the thought as well as the actors, who are not only the planning commissions or the ministers of finance, but who were the civil society, the academics, etc., who were able to sort of bring human development into a movement in my home country and contribute to issues of resilience. And I'm talking here about disparities, regional disparities. The parts of my home country that are hosting refugees right now were the topic of our human development discussion on inequality, on rights, on access to education, health, etc. This is the southeast, the Syrian border area, Syrian, Iran-Iraq border area of that country. I was able to do similar work in Albania and Romania, where I worked at that time to contribute to this. So the question will be, with the emerging topics, do you see the prospects of that cusp of national political action coalescing around the human development concept and the emerging subjects? How do you see the sort of local movement for this? There's nothing we're going to be able to do here unless countries on the ground have that cusp of political ownership.
Great, thanks. I think we had 2. No, it's okay. We have 2 more 1-minute interventions. I think. Yeah.
Congratulations on the book. I think it's a really important contribution to do this kind of work, to trace how an idea takes hold and where you keep it going. Which is looking to the future. I'm wondering if there's not, if at some point, if not already, human development will be facing a big credibility crisis, given that, okay, UNDP buys into it, bring this to developing countries, education is so much more than the bottom line, employment is so much more, but then when, say, those receiving countries look to the global north, the rich countries, what they see is what they do to stay competitive is completely based on quantification and the mentality of, let's stay competitive, what skills are marketable, that's how employees are rated, how students are rated, universities are rated. So at some point they might start asking questions like, why do you follow this creed, let's say, if you're not really living up to it, you're not really buying into it yourself.
Thank you.
Very
Yeah,
quickly,
Ted. Yeah.
Thank you. As a consumer for many years, HDI, it's been a great contribution to the work that I've been doing on democracy and governance. And thank you, Richard, for the slide. But my question is on a topic that hasn't come up in Built on Mars, which is on governance, rule of law, and corruption, and the impact of corruption on human development, and how politics and power distributions, as the World Bank report last year on governance and rule of law points out, has such a direct impact on the ability of humans to have full lives. And I'm just wondering, to what extent do you see that as a potential growth area, which also galvanizes politics at the local level, warring countries all over the world, and whether that connection can be more strongly made?
Right, great. Okay, so I'm going to give 1 minute to each of the panelists to pick and choose, but I do think what you said kind of summed up a lot and ties to Bob's comments about, how we know it's a new networked world. We need to galvanize kind of political and civil society communities in a different way, but how do we bring that, sorry to be blunt, towards the forces of good and outcomes that, we hope for, not some of the ones that Jeff was speaking on. Okay, so great. Can I start with you, Jonathan?
I'll just talk briefly about the how do we challenge the dominant growth paradigm if we're going to talk to a finance ministry in a country about human development. There is still no doubt that if you're a policymaker or an advisor who's got some bright idea that's going to threaten GDP in a country, it's going to be very difficult to sell that. But I think the human development paradigm has challenged that. It has made it easier to challenge that in that it's changed the narrative. I think the report was originally conceived as a tool for civil society to use in their power to sort of demonstrate to governments this is what, it's not all about growth. These other things matter. I think the Human Development Index, this number has been extremely powerful in that for some countries, in that really, we spend 90% of our effort writing the text in the report, but 90% of the attention goes to the tables at the back. And it's the governments calling up, and it's often the president. We get a message saying, why has my country gone down when next door's gone? This is a disgrace, I need to see people. So that in itself, it motivates better data. They start paying more attention. But that really has, put the fire into some people at least to start paying more attention to this. And the media get hold of it as well. So it's that competition between nations, I think, is extremely powerful.
Okay, great. Let me turn it over to Richard and then Anurava.
Great. I think we have a small division of labor. On the very first question from Mark, of course there's a risk if something tries to be everything. It's not, it represents nothing. Back to Jonathan's point on the importance of the composite indicators, zeroing in on those 3 pillars of the HDI was an important advancement for focusing people on things that were measurable. But even Amartya Sen, one of the originators of that index, said, this is such a crude index, I don't see how this is taking us forward. Well, when you saw the political and public communications value, but at the exact moment that they created the HDI, they took on some of my favorite issues, and many people in this room, political freedom, human rights, and they immediately was pushed back because of the level of rigor at the time in measuring those important pillars, which are indeed part of human development. We revisited them in the 2002, since we're plugging our favorite HDRs, Human Development 2002 on Deepening Democracy in a Fragmented World, tried to bring that back in. And all I can really say, though, is it's choosing a set of human development priorities and a given thematic annual issue. That going deep on those areas helps to define and focus policymakers. It is, as we've described today, more of a school of thought, a philosophy, rather than just a simple game plan. I didn't want to go on because we want to hear from others, but I will respond to Jeff's comments afterwards, and to say that corruption is yet another example of one of the areas for our friends at HDRO in New York and elsewhere, New Frontier, New Horizon issues. We dedicated Chapter 6 to those areas that could be taken up in future HDRs, and we encourage authors of HDRs to consider these as possibilities.
Okay. Anurava.
Yeah, very quickly, I think several of you have raised the same question, which is, beyond Washington, D.C. and New York, is human development salient politically at a national or subnational level? And of course, human development is a normative paradigm about how you imagine development to be. But even if I crudely looked at it in an instrumental sense, at least for democracies, it's become harder and harder to pitch the narrow version of development. Now, of course, I recognize that many economies across the world, especially within the emerging economies, there's a push towards investment-driven growth rather than consumption or people-centered growth, which gives you the headline numbers of GDP growth. But after 1 or 2 or 3 political or electoral cycles, you immediately come up against, this is jobless growth, or this is unequal growth, right? And that's going to bite back. So let me just give you a couple of examples, right? In India, for instance, under the current administration, between the late 1960s and about the mid-2010s, over the course of 50 years, about 120 million LPG, or clean cooking fuel cylinders, had been connected up to households. In the last 2 years, 70 million have been added. Right? This is part of what has now become the world's largest cash transfer scheme to deliver not just access to clean cooking fuel for the woman of the household, rather than who traditionally was not getting involved in the developmental choices, but also make sure the money uses technology to get delivered to, the subsidy gets delivered into the bank account. Sanitation example in Bangladesh, which then is getting adopted, the Total Sanitation Campaign in Bangladesh gets getting adopted in India through different words of Swachh Bharat, etc. I think the overall message is, or energy access, as I was mentioning earlier in terms of electricity access, the overall message is that governments are coming forward and putting out developmental indicators as something they're going to deliver upon. not just overall growth indicators. And the simple reason is, I say this a bit tongue-in-cheek, households vote, villages don't. Right? So if you are really interested in coming back to power, you cannot spin that I set up an electricity pole somewhere and therefore vote for me. You will only get that vote if the electricity came into your house, or if the water supply came into your house, or the LPG cylinder reached you, or your son or daughter got a job, right? And those are the metrics. Now, in authoritarian regimes, there might be a different incentive structure. But I think, and Mrs. Huck was mentioning earlier, democracy is a prerequisite for human security. I think democracy is a prerequisite for human development, even as we look at measurable and difficult to measure indicators.
Thank you so much. Over to you, Bob.
Well, I certainly learned a lot from these questions, so I thank those who asked them and the answers. On next topics, I spent a lot of time now on the conflict question, and conflicts come from the breakdown of democracy and the breakdown of democracy and the breakdown of politics. Often, I believe, get traced back to a breakdown of the tolerance of civil society. And we've had real erosions of civil society around the world. It's a great political sad. And I must say, national and multilateral defenders of civil society are few and far between. And just to pick on the UN for a moment, I love the UN. But more and more of their meetings are closed to civil society. And civil society is having a rough time in a lot of these discussions. So if you can't even make it in the UN, how can you make it in your own country? So again, tracing back to kind of figure out where do you apply your pressures on these things. I get worried about this stuff, but I also have to remind myself that the human development movement in the world has created more positive change than just about anything you can think of. So it's wonderful to see that this movement is continuing with bright people involved.
Thank you. Mrs. Huck, let me turn it over to you.
I'm very confused about all these discussions here. I don't know what you're trying to focus on. Are you trying to focus on why we don't get new good ideas like it happened with Mahbub Haq or human development or the other period? So I would really say that all these exciting ideas, they come out of exciting people and exciting period. 2017, have we seen any exciting people either in the international institutions, the UN, or the national governments? You go all over the world, think about it. Who is really exciting, can excite the whole world about some great ideas? You can't even produce someone like Grameen Bank, that kind of people. Because those were the days when people really used to think seriously about national issues, personal issues, global issues. Because I remember this some kind of a document I just produced, some ideas which are lying in the newspaper columns sometime. So I just put them together in 2-3 months and got this book out. You look at the 80s. I did it by 80s. In 80s, all the ideas you think about later on, which came out of good institutions, good organizations. There was a food proposals for a global food order. The World Bank, the IMF debt refinancing facility, the UNCTAD 7, and global economic management, and UN's role in human development and human security. These, we were discussing it all the time in different, like this kind of gatherings. So there are people with ideas, they will come and talk these things out. And they will figure out how to put it through institutions or through media. and they were interested in this. Even the media, like in the UN, there was this media, Third World something, I forget the name. Their articles are so good. I mean, I remember in the women's conference, they got all these ideas about, you know, what would the UN do for women's empowerment. Nowadays, you don't see any organizations, because I keep thinking that good ideas and good people with good ideas have the courage to do all of these things. If A, they don't have to worry about, you know, institutional restrictions. There are a lot of institutional restrictions these days to come out and write about these issues. People don't write about these issues anymore. Because I have problem in getting stuff to the center, because we think of ourselves as a very progressive institution, but people are not progressive. They're tied to the jobs. They're tied to the institutional constraints. So you don't get good ideas to change the world, to change the institution. It's very, very difficult. My point is, this is a very difficult time in developing good policies, good proposals, so that you can move the world. People don't get moved like this. Even, you know, so many horrible things happen, whether it's in, you know, I don't know to name any names, but even recently, you know, New York, what was the place, Charlottesville or something?
Charlottesville, yeah.
I mean, these things, in the 80s and 90s, they didn't think about these things. They were a Third World Forum. I remember we were a big person in the Third World Forum. And there we'll discuss that we are not getting a good deal. Prince Guerrero and Raul Brandishin, everybody will be in that big group. Now those people won't even enter any office these days. But it was there. They talked about these issues. So I don't know. We have to, all of us have to think seriously about, you know, what are the real issues we want to discuss. At least one single issue we can discuss, not either human development is right or wrong, or, you know, economic growth is right or wrong, or the World Bank is right or wrong. One doesn't know. You know, World Bank, have you seen anybody in the World Bank these days who can really sort of stand up and say that what you are saying, what you are doing is not right? You cannot do that. Because you should have the courage to be able to think through these issues from the point of view of people. Those days are gone. So if we are seriously about thinking about those days, we start from the young students in the universities, go and talk to them and see what they think. If I go talk to the students, first thing they think is that we are looking for a job. You know that. You know, all the young people, they will tell you that I cannot get a job anywhere because they are looking for a job. You cannot tell them, give them some revolutionary ideas. There's a very lot of people in the institution. So, you know, ideas come where people of ideas are there.
Yeah.
And they are encouraged, and they have audience for their views.
Yeah. Well, I do really appreciate, first, as a lot of what you're saying in terms of it being an extremely difficult time. I think some of you heard me say before, I am by disposition an optimist. And I think that, you know, it's easy to get stuck in the moment. I agree with Fatima about having these times to kind of take a step back and actually look at the arc of progress that has occurred. And you referenced that, Bob. And even just personally, you know, thinking about how, you know, being an intern for Professor Gus Reynes, who introduced me to Frances Stewart, who then introduced me to you, Mrs. Huck, and how in that trajectory there are young people. I'm not young anymore, but there are people who are seeking the right questions and the right answers. So I really appreciate all the time that you've taken here today, and actually do want to leave you both with these books, and also thinking about, you know, even in these difficult moments, you know, what are the ideas, what is the people power, the civil society, and what can we do as individuals and as groups and institutions to advance progress. So thank you so much.
Give my best to Oleg.
I fly out tomorrow,
Yeah, can I?
but I'm back again in October. Sure, I will. Yeah.
Can I write? I'm out of cars, so let me just write down. Yeah.